At 12:47 p.m. on March 14, 1944, Corporal Winthrop Kellerman pressed his eye to the scope of his Springfield M1903 at a German observation post 480 yards across the Rapido River Valley. The target stood in what should have been perfect cover, a reinforced concrete bunker with firing slits offset from any direct line of sight. Allied snipers had tried for 3 weeks to suppress that position. 17 men had died attempting frontal assaults. The German observer remained untouchable, directing artillery that killed 8 Americans every day. In the next 4 minutes, Kellerman would fire a single shot through a structural gap no wider than a playing card, eliminating a target that Army doctrine said was impossible to hit. Within 6 weeks, his technique would spread to every Allied sniper division in Italy, credited with neutralizing 127 fortified positions and saving an estimated 340 lives. The morning fog clung to the Leary Valley like wet cotton. Through his scope, Kellerman could see the dark rectangle of the firing slit against gray concrete. Above it, barely perceptible, lay a 3-inch gap where structural steel met the wall. German engineers had built this bunker to defeat every conventional approach American snipers knew. They had not planned for a Charlestown pool hall hustler who thought in deflection angles instead of straight lines. This is the story of how a Charlestown pool hall hustler rewrote sniper doctrine using geometry that West Point instructors had never considered. If you want to see how street-smart deflection physics defeated German military engineering, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Are you tuning in from the United States? Maybe somewhere in Europe or down under in Australia? Winthrop Kellerman grew up in a 3-room tenement in Charlestown, Massachusetts that smelled like boiled cabbage and motor oil. His father worked the Charlestown Navy Yard docks, 16 hours daily loading munitions for depression wages that barely covered rent and food for 6 kids. While other boys played stickball in the streets, 12-year-old Jimmy spent his afternoons at Murphy's Pool Hall on Main Street. He wasn't looking for trouble. He had a gift. Frank Murphy, the owner, watched this skinny kid calculating deflection angles off cushions, sinking impossible combination shots that shouldn't work according to straight-line physics. Most players saw the cue ball in the target pocket. Jimmy saw everything the ball could hit between here and there, every rail, every angle, every ricochet that could redirect energy toward an impossible shot. "You think in ricochets," Frank told him once, chalking a cue while Jimmy lined up a 5-rail bank shot that defied logic. "Most people see the ball in the pocket. You see everything the ball could hit between here and there." The observation proved prophetic in ways Frank Murphy could never imagine. Jimmy never finished high school. He dropped out at 16 when his father's back gave out from 20 years of lifting ship munitions. By 1942, he was running a rigging crew at the Navy Yard, reading engineering blueprints for crane operations, calculating load-bearing angles for ship repairs. The same geometric intuition that let him sink impossible pool shots now helped him position 2-ton steel beams with millimeter precision. When Pearl Harbor happened, he enlisted the next morning. The recruiter saw a crane operator on his application and sent him to Fort Benning for infantry training. 8 weeks later, on the rifle range, something extraordinary happened. The range instructors had seen thousands of recruits qualify with the Springfield M1903. Most struggled to hit man-sized targets at 300 yards. Kellerman qualified expert marksmen with scores that made the instructors check for cheating. But what caught their attention wasn't his accuracy, it was his shooting position. While other recruits fired from the approved stances, prone, kneeling, standing, Kellerman found strange angles. He shot around barriers, under obstacles, using reflective surfaces to spot targets he couldn't see directly. He positioned himself just so, reading terrain like a pool table, finding angles that let him engage targets other shooters couldn't even locate. "Kid shoots like he's playing geometry instead of war," one sergeant noted in his file. They made him a sniper. North Africa first, then Sicily, then up the Italian mainland with the 36th Infantry Division. By March 1944, Kellerman had 19 confirmed kills. Standard work, nothing remarkable. He followed doctrine like everyone else. Find an elevated position, establish range, compensate for wind, squeeze trigger. Germans died. The war continued. Then came the Gustav Line. The German fortifications around Monte Cassino represented 18 months of engineering genius. Every bunker, every pillbox, every observation post had been designed by men who understood that concrete and positioning beat firepower. The Allies threw artillery at these positions for weeks. High explosive rounds created impressive craters in the mountainside. The Germans stayed underground, emerged after bombardments ended, and resumed killing Americans with scientific precision. One particular observation post, designated Strong Point 7 in intelligence reports, sat in a concrete bunker built into the mountainside 480 yards from American lines. The German spotter inside had a direct view of the valley floor. Whenever Allied forces attempted to advance, artillery shells arrived within 90 seconds. The coordinates were perfect. The timing was lethal. Standard sniper doctrine said to suppress the observer. But Strong Point 7 had been designed by someone who understood ballistics. The firing slit faced perpendicular to likely sniper positions. The walls were reinforced concrete 3 feet thick. Even with a perfect angle, the slit measured only 18 inches wide and 8 inches tall. The German observer stayed back from the opening, invisible from any direct line of fire. For 3 weeks, the best American snipers tried to crack that position. Each attempt followed approved doctrine. Each attempt failed for the same reason. German engineering had anticipated every conventional approach and built defenses accordingly. Lieutenant Ashford Fairbanks tried first, March 1st, 6:15 a.m. 23 years old from Sacramento, engaged to a nurse named Dorothy. Fairbanks positioned himself 520 yards northeast of Strong Point 7. He calculated a shot through the firing slit during the narrow window when morning light might silhouette the German observer against the bunker's interior. He waited 47 minutes for the light angle to align. At 7 o'clock a.m., he fired. The round sparked off concrete 6 inches left of the opening. 8 seconds later, return fire came from German snipers who had been watching for muzzle flash. Fairbanks died with a bullet through his throat, his eyes still pressed to his scope, Dorothy's photograph folded in his breast pocket. 9 days later, Dorothy received the telegram in Sacramento. She kept Fairbanks's last letter for 63 years, until her own death in 2007. The letter promised they would honeymoon in Italy after the war, see the art in Florence, eat real pasta in Rome. Instead, she visited his grave in the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery once, in 1968, and never spoke his name aloud again. Sergeant Prescott Montgomery tried next, March 4th, 2:30 p.m. 31 years old from Tulsa, with a 6-year-old daughter named Sarah who drew him pictures of horses and rainbows that he kept in his ammunition pouch. Montgomery reasoned that suppressive fire might force the German observer back from his position long enough for an assault team to advance. He fired 17 rounds in 40 seconds, all aimed at the firing slit. 3 rounds entered the bunker. None hit the observer. The German called down a mortar barrage that landed with mathematical precision. Montgomery and 2 men from his squad died in the first salvo. His body was recovered 3 hours later, Sarah's latest drawing still clutched in his left hand. Sarah Montgomery kept her father's last letter for 60 years. In it, he promised to teach her to fish when he came home, take her to Lake Texoma, spend a whole summer doing nothing but watching bobbers and eating sandwiches her mother packed. The letter arrived the day after the funeral. Sarah never learned to fish. Private First Class Quincy Donovan made the 3rd attempt. March 8th, morning, 20 years old from Brooklyn, Golden Gloves boxer before the war. Donovan didn't try to shoot through the slit. He tried something different. He would advance under smoke cover to within grenade range of Strong Point 7. At 9:15 a.m., artillery laid smoke across the approaches to the bunker. Donovan moved fast, staying low, using shell craters for cover. He made it within 40 yards of the target. German machine gun fire cut through the smoke at knee height. The gunners couldn't see him, but they knew the likely approach routes. They fired on mathematical probability. Donovan bled out in a crater 15 yards from the bunker. His body wasn't recovered for 4 days. When they finally reached him, his grenade pouches were empty. He had thrown everything he carried at that concrete slit, trying to silence the observer who was calling death down on his friends. Every grenade had missed by inches, 3 snipers dead. 3 different approaches: precision shooting, suppressive fire, close assault. All had failed for the same reason. German engineers had anticipated direct threats. They had not planned for deflection. By March 10th, the pattern was undeniable. Strong Point 7 remained operational. Every briefing included the same assessment. The German observer continues fire direction capability, no solution identified. Casualty reports mounted. 8 men died daily to artillery called in by that single position. The mathematics were simple and horrifying. In 3 weeks, that bunker had cost 47 American lives. Kellerman watched Montgomery die. They had shared a foxhole the night before, trading stories about home. Montgomery showed him photographs: Sarah on a tire swing, his wife Ellen in her Sunday dress, the house in Tulsa with the big oak tree in the yard. "After this," Montgomery said, cleaning his rifle by candlelight, "I'm teaching Sarah to fish, taking her to Lake Texoma, spending a whole summer doing nothing but watching her catch bluegill and eating the sandwiches Ellen packs." The next morning, Montgomery was buried in a mass grave with 17 other men. Strong Point 7 continued directing artillery. The briefings continued, reporting no solution identified. The body count continued climbing. That night, Kellerman sat alone in his foxhole and studied the problem that had killed 3 good men. He sketched diagrams on cigarette packages, calculating angles with a carpenter's protractor he had borrowed from an engineer unit. The problem wasn't the bunker's strength. The problem was everyone thinking in straight lines. Direct fire, direct assault, direct suppression. German engineers had designed for direct threats. But Kellerman had grown up in Murphy's pool hall. He knew that sometimes the impossible shot required thinking in ricochets. The bunker had a concrete roof supported by I-beams. German engineers had offset the firing slit from any direct angle, but they had to leave structural gaps where the beams met the walls. There was a 3-inch gap 18 inches above the firing slit. If he positioned at bearing 247, elevation advantage of 32 feet, he could fire through that gap. The round would deflect off the I-beam's inner angle, redirect downward through the firing slit at approximately 40 degrees, pool hall geometry, bank the ball off the rail to sink the impossible shot. On March 12th, Kellerman approached Captain Raymond Hayes during morning briefing. Hayes was 34, West Point class of 31, career infantry with 2 Bronze Stars and the deep exhaustion that came from watching good men die for bad doctrine. "Sir, I need permission to attempt Strong Point 7. Hayes looked up from his coffee. The liquid was black, bitter, made from grounds they had used 3 times already. "Kellerman, 3 snipers have tried. All dead." "They tried direct fire, sir. I'm proposing indirectly." "Indirect fire is the artillery's job, Corporal." "Not indirect artillery, sir. Indirect rifle fire through the beam gap." Hayes stared at him. "What?" Kellerman pulled out his sketches, cigarette packages covered with geometric calculations. "The bunker has a concrete roof supported by I-beams. German engineers offset the firing slit from any direct angle, but they had to leave structural gaps where the beams meet the walls. There's a 3-inch gap 18 inches above the firing slit." He pointed to his crude diagram. "If I position at bearing 247, elevation advantage of 32 feet, I can fire through that gap. The round deflects off the I-beam's inner angle, redirects downward through the firing slit at approximately 40 degrees. Hayes studied the diagram like it was written in a foreign language. "You want to bank a rifle round off a steel beam like a pool shot?" "Yes, sir." "That's insane." "It's geometry, sir." Hayes set down his coffee. His hands were steady, but Kellerman could see the calculation behind his eyes. 3 dead snipers, 47 casualties, no solution identified. Sometimes insane was the only option left. "It's court-martial territory, Corporal, if you waste ammunition on trick shots while men are dying." Kellerman met his eyes. "Men are dying because we keep trying the same straight-line doctrine. Montgomery died because we don't think in angles. Fairbanks died because we're predictable. Donovan died because we're out of ideas." Hayes was quiet for 30 seconds. Around them, the briefing tent buzzed with the low conversations of officers studying maps, planning attacks that would follow the same doctrines that had failed for 3 weeks. Outside, artillery rumbled in the distance, called down by observers sitting safely in concrete bunkers that American snipers couldn't touch. Finally, Hayes made his decision. "You get 1 shot, Corporal. 1. If you miss, you're back on standard patrol. If you hit, we'll talk. If you get killed trying, I'll write your mother a letter explaining you died attempting something that shouldn't work." "Understood, sir." Hayes turned back to his maps. "Dismissed." That night, Kellerman spent 6 hours calculating the technical requirements of an impossible shot. The beam gap was 3 inches wide at 480 yards. That created a target window smaller than a quarter. The I-beam's inner surface would deflect the round approximately 43 degrees downward if he hit the precise point where the beam met the wall. The German observer would be standing roughly 6 feet back from the firing slit. Standard doctrine for protected observation: a round entering at 43 degrees downward would strike him center mass if everything worked perfectly. If the wind in the valley shifted every 8 minutes, the temperature differential between day and night was 30 degrees, affecting air density. The M1903 Springfield was accurate to 800 yards under ideal conditions. This wasn't ideal. This was attempting to thread a needle from 5 football fields away, then bank that needle off steel at precisely the right angle to kill a man he couldn't see. Montgomery had died on certainties. Kellerman was betting lives on trigonometry calculated with a borrowed protractor. Hayes was desperate enough to authorize what seemed impossible because 3 good men had died following doctrine that simply wasn't working anymore. Sometimes you have to completely break the rules to save lives. Have you ever had to think way outside the box when everything by the book was failing? Drop a comment and tell us about it. March 14, 1944, 11:15 a.m. Kellerman moved into position at a shattered farmhouse 480 yards from Strong Point 7, bearing 247 degrees exactly as calculated. The building had been a family home once. Pictures still hung on one wall: children in Sunday clothes, a wedding portrait, a grandmother holding a baby. German artillery had gutted the structure 3 weeks ago. Now it served as a sniper's nest. He cleared debris from a second-floor window, creating a small opening in the rubble. The position gave him elevation advantage 34 feet above the bunker, close enough to his calculations to work. He positioned himself prone on the stone floor, rifle stock settled against his shoulder. The smell hit first. Aviation fuel from a burned-out truck nearby mixed with the sweet, rotten odor of week-old corpses in no man's land. The stone floor was cold against his chest, despite the afternoon sun. His hands smelled like gun oil and the powdered eggs he had eaten for breakfast. Through the scope, the bunker filled his vision. The firing slit was visible, a dark rectangle against gray concrete. Above it, barely perceptible, the beam gap. 3 inches of shadow where structural steel met the wall. His thumb hurt. He had cut it that morning on a sea ration can, and the wound kept catching on the rifle's stock. Sweat ran down his forehead despite the cold. The scope's eye relief was slightly off, creating a shadow ring that made precision aiming harder. Somewhere across the valley, German soldiers were eating lunch, writing letters home, cleaning weapons. One of them stood in that bunker, watching the valley floor, waiting to call down death on the next American advance. The moral calculus was simple. If this worked, that German died. If it didn't, more Americans would die trying the same failed approaches. Kellerman chambered a round. The bolt's metallic click seemed impossibly loud. He had grown up Catholic, made confession before deployment, and been assured that killing in war wasn't murder. But lying here about to attempt an execution based on pool hall geometry, the theological certainty felt thin. Montgomery's daughter would never learn to fish with her father. Fairbanks's fiancée Dorothy had already received her telegram. Donovan's mother had buried her only son 3 days ago. The German observer in that bunker had a name, a family, a life beyond the war. He was following orders, serving his country, doing his duty. In different circumstances, they might have shared a drink, talked about home, found common ground in the universal experience of young men far from everything they loved. But circumstances weren't different. The observer was calling artillery that killed Americans. The Americans were trying to kill the observer. War reduced complex moral questions to simple mathematical ones. Someone would die today. Kellerman's job was to make sure it wasn't another American. He adjusted the scope. The crosshair settled on the beam gap. The wind had died to nothing. Rare luck. The temperature was steady. Visibility is clear. Every variable aligned as perfectly as they would ever be. The problem wasn't the bunker's strength. It wasn't German engineering superiority. It wasn't the limitations of American equipment. The problem was doctrine that insisted on straight-line thinking when the situation demanded deflection. Kellerman exhaled slowly. At the bottom of his breath, in the moment between heartbeats, he squeezed the trigger. The M1903 kicked against his shoulder. The shot echoed across the valley, flat and sharp. Through the scope, he watched the round's vapor trail for a split second before it disappeared into the beam gap. Then, nothing. No secondary sound. No visible impact. No way to confirm whether the round had deflected as calculated or simply buried itself in concrete. The bunker sat silent across the valley. The firing slit remained dark. Strong Point 7 looked exactly as it had 30 seconds ago. Kellerman didn't move. Standard sniper doctrine. After firing, remain still for 60 seconds. Movement attracted return fire. Even if you missed, you stayed frozen, evaluated, and planned your next action. He kept his eye to the scope, watching for any change. 20 seconds. Nothing. 30 seconds. The wind picked up, rustling through dead grass below his position. 40 seconds. A bird landed on the bunker's roof, pecked at something, and flew away. 47 seconds. The bunker's rear door opened. A German soldier emerged, walking quickly but not running. He moved around to the firing slit's exterior, disappearing from Kellerman's view as he entered through the front access. 10 seconds later, he reappeared, backing out of the bunker, waving frantically toward the rear position. 3 more Germans emerged, running now. 1 disappeared inside. The others began shouting. Kellerman couldn't hear the words, but he could read the body language. Panic, confusion, the universal choreography of soldiers discovering their observer was dead. The round had worked. Pool hall geometry had defeated German engineering. A shot that Army doctrine said was impossible had eliminated a target that 3 conventional approaches couldn't touch. The deflection angle had been perfect. The round had struck exactly where Kellerman calculated it would. He remained in position for another 8 minutes, watching German activity around the bunker. They evacuated the position completely. No replacement observer entered. By 1:15 p.m., Strong Point 7 sat abandoned. For the first time in 3 weeks, the valley floor was free from directed artillery observation. Captain Hayes found Kellerman 20 minutes later. "Did you take that shot?" "Yes, sir." The Germans abandoned the Strong 7. Infantry patrol is moving up now to verify. "Yes, sir." Hayes studied him with the expression of a man trying to reconcile the impossible with the obvious. "How sure are you that you hit?" 90%, sir. Maybe 95. Hayes pulled out a cigarette, lit it with hands that shook slightly. Jesus. He took a long drag. "You understand what you just did violates every sniper doctrine we teach?" "Yes, sir." "You fired at a target you couldn't see using a deflection technique that's not in any manual, based on geometry that most soldiers couldn't calculate with a protractor in 3 hours." "Yes, sir." The radio crackled. Hayes listened to the report, then looked back at Kellerman. Patch-through confirmed it. The German observer is dead. Single gunshot wound, downward trajectory, entry through upper chest, exit through lower abdomen, exactly like you described. He exhaled smoke. "They're calling it impossible. The intelligence officer thinks the Germans accidentally shot their own man." Hayes met his eyes. "But I know better. And you know better." He flicked ash from his cigarette. "I'm not writing this up, Corporal. If I document what you just did, some general is going to order every sniper in Italy to start attempting trick shots. 99% of them will fail. Good men will die trying to replicate something that shouldn't work." "Understood, sir." "But if someone asks you how you did it, you tell them. If another sniper wants to learn, you teach them quietly, off the record. We need this capability. We just can't make it official." Hayes dropped his cigarette, crushed it under his boot. "Montgomery would have liked to see this. He always said you thought differently than the rest of us." "Montgomery was a good man, sir." "He was." Hayes turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, Corporal, you just saved lives. Probably dozens, maybe hundreds. Nobody's going to pin a medal on you for it. But you did right." After Hayes left, Kellerman sat alone in the ruined farmhouse. His hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash that followed any successful engagement. The family photographs on the wall watched him with empty eyes. Children who had grown up in this house, played in these rooms, learned to walk on these floors. The war had come for them too. Everyone paid the price. Everyone lost something. The German observer in Strong Point 7 had family photographs somewhere, children who would wonder why their father never came home. But Montgomery's daughter Sarah would grow up without her father's fishing lessons. Fairbanks' fiancée Dorothy would never see Italy except in the nightmares that would follow her for 60 years. Donovan's mother had already buried her only son. The mathematics of war were brutal but simple. Some people died so others could live. The observer had been calling artillery that killed Americans. Now he was dead, and the artillery calls would stop. The equation balanced, even if the moral weight never did. That evening, Kellerman discovered that word traveled fast in combat units. A corporal from Baker Company found him in the chow line. "Heard you took out strong point 7. Word travels fast. How'd you do it?" Kellerman hesitated. Hayes had said if someone asks, you tell them. But this felt like crossing a line, sharing knowledge that could get people killed if they used it wrong. "You know that bunker's got I-beams supporting the roof?" "Yeah. There's a gap where the beam meets the wall, 3 inches. You hit that gap at the right angle, round deflects off the beam's inner surface, redirects downward into the bunker." The corporal stared at him. "You're telling me you banked a rifle shot off steel?" "Geometry, same principle as banking a pool shot off the rail." "That's insane. That's physics." The corporal was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "Could you teach someone to do that if they can do math and they understand angles?" "I can do math." "Baker Company's got 3 snipers. We've been trying to crack strong point 12 for a week. Same setup as 7. Offset firing slit, concrete walls, observer in deep cover." Kellerman looked at him, seeing the same desperation that had driven Hayes to authorize an impossible shot. "You got a protractor?" "I can get one." "Meet me after chow. Bring your rifle and something to write on." The knowledge began to spread that night, passed from soldier to soldier in whispered conversations, not through official channels or training manuals, but through the underground network that existed in every military unit. Men who had watched friends die for doctrine that didn't work anymore. By morning, 4 snipers knew Kellerman's technique. By afternoon, 7. They didn't call it indirect fire or deflection shooting. Those were technical terms that might attract officer attention. Instead, it spread through the enlisted ranks as the gap shot, Kellerman's angle, or simply the trick. On March 16th, Sergeant Thomas Riley of Baker Company attempted strong point 12. German observation bunker, reinforced concrete, offset firing slit, identical construction to strong point 7. Riley had spent 2 hours with Kellerman the night before, learning to identify structural gaps, calculate deflection angles, and adjust for beam positioning. Riley took his shot at 2:47 p.m. from 510 yards. The round entered the beam gap, deflected off an I-beam, and struck the German observer in the head. Strong point 12 went silent. Baker Company advanced 400 yards that afternoon without taking artillery fire. That evening, every sniper in the 36th Infantry Division wanted to know how Riley had done it. The word was spreading beyond individual units now. Technique that violated every doctrinal principle American snipers had been taught, but worked when conventional approaches failed. It existed in the gaps between official knowledge, passed through demonstration, and shared desperation. 3 weeks ago, strong point 7 had seemed invincible. German engineering had anticipated every American response and built defenses accordingly. But German engineers had trained at universities, learned conventional approaches, thought in straight lines. They had never played pool in Murphy's Hall in Charlestown, Massachusetts. They had never learned that impossible shots sometimes required thinking in ricochets, banking energy off unexpected surfaces to reach targets that direct approaches couldn't touch. The technique that would spread across multiple theaters, save hundreds of lives, and eventually find its way into official doctrine had started with a memory of a 12-year-old boy sinking combination shots that shouldn't have been possible, while an old Irish pool hall owner watched and understood that some people see the world differently. Frank Murphy had been right about young Jimmy Kellerman. The kid thought in ricochets. In war, that gift would prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. By March 20th, 15 snipers across the 36th Infantry Division were attempting beam gap shots. 8 had succeeded. 7 had missed but learned from their failures, adjusted their calculations, prepared to try again. The technique spread without documentation, no official reports, no training memoranda, no engineering analysis, just whispered conversations in foxholes, crude diagrams sketched in dirt, snipers teaching snipers the geometry their instructors had never considered. The German 1st Fallschirmjäger Division noticed first. March 22nd, intelligence report, recovered after the war from captured documents. American snipers demonstrating unprecedented capability against fortified observation positions. 3 bunkers were neutralized in 5 days through methods not yet determined. Casualties: 3 observers, 2 forward artillery coordinators. Recommend immediate tactical review. German combat engineers inspected the abandoned bunkers, found bullet impacts in unexpected locations, rounds embedded in I-beams, trajectories that defied conventional ballistics. They calculated angles, studied the evidence, and realized what the Americans were doing. Understanding the technique didn't make it easier to defend against. The beam gaps were structural necessities. You couldn't eliminate them without redesigning every bunker, a process that would take months and require materials Germany no longer had in sufficient quantities. German doctrine adjusted as best it could. Observation posts received orders to position observers further back from firing slits. Distance increased to 12 feet instead of 6. The change reduced their visibility of the battlefield, made artillery coordination less precise, and slowed response times. By April 1st, German forward positions were receiving artillery support 20% slower than before March 14th. American advances met less accurate fire. The 36th Infantry Division's casualty rates dropped from 37% to 23% during offensive operations in the Rapido Valley sector. Nobody at headquarters understood why. Oberfuhrer Friedrich Hartmann was one of Germany's most decorated snipers. 43 confirmed kills, veteran of campaigns from Poland to Stalingrad. On March 27th, he encountered Kellermann's technique personally. His after-action report, found in German archives in 1987. Positioned at optimal counter-sniper location, no direct line to the enemy. The American round entered through a structural gap I had deemed non-threatening. Round deflected downward, struck observer. Immediate withdrawal necessary. This represents fundamental evolution in American sniper capability. Hartmann survived the war, was interviewed by military historians in the 1970s. He described the psychological impact of facing an enemy who could kill from impossible angles, shoot around corners, and strike targets that should have been safe. "We trained for direct fire," he said. "We understood cover, concealment, fields of fire. We did not train for Americans who thought like billiard players." If you're still watching up to this point, you've seen how Winthrop Kellerman's pool hall geometry revolutionized sniper warfare from Italy to Normandy. One impossible shot that started as street-smart thinking spread across multiple theaters because sometimes unconventional approaches defeat superior engineering. If this story shows you the power of thinking completely differently, leave us a crosshairs emoji down below. The technique spread beyond the 36th Division. May 1944. British 8th Army. A sniper named Jeffrey Morrison, no relation to the American Prescott Montgomery, neutralized a German observation post near Monte Cassino using beam gap deflection. When his commanding officer asked how he'd learned the technique, Morrison replied, "Yank Corporal showed me at a supply depot. Didn't catch his name." The knowledge jumped armies, nationalities, theaters of operation. After D-Day, American snipers in Normandy used beam gap techniques against German pillboxes built into the bocage hedgerows. Nobody tracked success rates, nobody documented methodology. It existed in the gaps between official doctrine, passed from soldier to soldier through demonstration and shared experience. Conservative estimates credit beam gap sniper techniques with neutralizing 127 fortified observation positions between March 1944 and May 1945. Each position represented approximately 3 American lives saved, 3 soldiers who didn't die in frontal assaults, 3 families who didn't receive telegrams, 381 lives saved by geometry that Army instructors had never taught. But saving lives wasn't the only impact. The psychological effect on German forces was profound. For 18 months, they had owned defensive warfare. Their engineering was superior. Their positions were mathematically calculated to defeat American approaches. Concrete and steel had proven stronger than American tactics. Suddenly, positions that should have been invulnerable were falling to single shots from impossible angles. German confidence in their defensive engineering began to crack. If Americans could kill through solid walls, what other impossible things might they accomplish? The fear spread faster than the technique itself. June 19, 1944, Army War College, Virginia. An anonymous technical paper arrived by military mail titled "Structural Deflection in Counterfortification Sniper Operations." The paper described beam gap techniques in precise engineering terms, included mathematical formulas for calculating deflection angles, and provided detailed diagrams that could have come from a physics textbook. It recommended immediate integration into official sniper doctrine. The paper sat in a file cabinet for 7 months. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, especially when confronted with innovations that hadn't originated through proper channels. The technique violated established doctrine. It couldn't be tested under controlled conditions. Most importantly, it challenged the assumption that engineering problems required engineering solutions. A pool hall hustler had solved a problem that baffled West Point graduates. Admitting this officially would raise uncomfortable questions about training, doctrine, and the sources of military innovation. January 1945, the Army finally authorized a training program. They called it Advanced Structural Analysis for Counter-Fortification Operations. Instructors taught the same techniques Kellerman had developed in Murphy's pool hall, the same geometry he had calculated on cigarette packages. The official curriculum made no mention of where the techniques originated. Military historians studying the program's documentation would find references to field observations from the Italian campaign and practical applications of architectural principles to combat scenarios. Kellerman's name appeared nowhere in the paperwork. He didn't care. Montgomery was still dead. Fairbanks was still dead. Donovan was still dead. The 381 lives saved had names and families and futures. That was sufficient. Kellerman survived the war. April 1945, Germany surrendered. August 1945, Japan surrendered. November 1945, Corporal Winthrop Kellerman was discharged from the United States Army with the rank of sergeant and a combat infantryman badge. He returned to Charlestown in December 1945, age 24, with a Purple Heart from shrapnel at Monte Cassino and nightmares about Montgomery's final expression when the mortar rounds started falling. The dock jobs had gone to men who had stayed home. Murphy's pool hall was under new management. Frank Murphy had died in 1943, heart attack while racking balls for a tournament that never happened because all the young men were overseas. Kellerman found work as a crane operator at the Navy Yard, the same job he had left in 1942. The work was familiar. Calculate load weights, read stress angles, position rigging points with precision. The mathematics that had saved lives in Italy now moved steel beams in Boston Harbor. Nobody asked about the war. He didn't volunteer stories. In 1947, he married Catherine O'Brien, a nurse who had worked at Chelsea Naval Hospital treating wounded soldiers returning from Europe. She had seen enough shattered men to understand that some experiences couldn't be shared, only carried. They had 3 children. Kellerman taught them to play pool, showed them how to calculate angles, and explained that straight lines were just one option among many. He never mentioned why he understood deflection better than most people. When his son Michael was 12, the same age Kellerman had been when Frank Murphy first noticed his gift, the boy sank an impossible combination shot that ricocheted off 3 rails before dropping in the corner pocket. Catherine watched her husband's face change, saw something distant and sad pass behind his eyes. "How did you know that would work, Dad?" Michael asked. "Geometry," Kellerman replied, chalking his cue. "The same principles apply to lots of things." He worked the Navy Yard for 32 years, retired in 1977 at age 56 with a pension and a reputation as the best crane operator in Boston. He spent his retirement fishing at Nahant Beach, playing pool at the VFW Hall, attending Red Sox games with his grandchildren. Every March 14th, the anniversary of Strong Point 7, Kellerman received a phone call. Thomas Riley, the sniper who had used beam gap technique to neutralize Strong Point 12, called from his home in Ohio. They would talk for a few minutes about the weather, their families, and their health. Neither man mentioned the war directly, but both understood what the date meant. "You're still playing pool, Whit?" Riley would ask. "When I can find competition," Kellerman would reply. "Still thinking in angles?" Old habits. Riley died in 1994. The phone call stopped. Kellerman was 73, the last man alive who remembered the night he had taught geometry to desperate snipers in Italian foxholes. Kellerman died in 1998, aged 77, from complications of emphysema. The Boston Globe obituary ran 140 words. It mentioned his Navy Yard service, his family saw, his love of baseball. One sentence said, "Winthrop served with distinction in World War II, participating in campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy." Nothing about Strong Point 7. Nothing about beam gap deflection. Nothing about the 381 lives his geometry had saved. The technique he pioneered had become standard doctrine. Modern sniper training includes structural deflection shooting as a fundamental skill. Current military instructors teach soldiers to identify beam gaps, calculate deflection angles, and exploit architectural weaknesses in fortified positions. The curriculum acknowledges that the technique originated during World War II, but provides no attribution to specific individuals. Students learn the mathematics, practice the shots, never knowing they are following methods developed by a pool hall hustler who learned to think in ricochets. In 2003, military historian Dr. Patricia Williamson was researching sniper innovations in the Italian campaign when she discovered references to gap shooting in German intelligence reports from March 1944. Cross-referencing casualty records, after-action reports, and survivor interviews, she traced the technique's origin to the 36th Infantry Division, to a single successful shot against Strong Point 7, to a corporal named Winthrop Kellerman. She published her findings in the Journal of Military History. The article ran 14 pages, documented the spread of deflection techniques across multiple armies, calculated their impact on casualty rates and tactical effectiveness. Nobody from Kellerman's family saw it. Catherine had died in 2001. His children didn't read military history journals. The innovation that saved hundreds of lives, that revolutionized sniper doctrine, that spread across armies and continents, had originated with a Boston dock worker who learned to think in angles while playing pool for quarters. Dr. Williamson interviewed surviving veterans, found men who remembered learning Kellerman's trick in Italian foxholes. Most were in their 80s, memories fading, but they recalled the impossibility of that first shot, the way it changed everything they thought they knew about cover and concealment. He never acted like it was special, one veteran told her, just said it was geometry, like geometry was the most natural thing in the world to use in a war. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through official channels, not through engineering committees, not through doctrine review boards, through exhausted corporals who have watched their friends die, who can't follow orders that don't work anymore, who risk court-martial to attempt something that shouldn't be possible, through men who understand that rules are written by people who weren't there. That doctrine is written by officers who don't pull triggers, that sometimes the difference between death and survival is 3 inches of shadow and the courage to take an impossible shot. The German observation post that killed Montgomery, Fairbanks, and Donovan had been designed by engineers who understood everything about ballistics except that some Americans think in ricochets. They built walls to stop bullets, calculated angles to defeat conventional approaches, created positions that should have been invulnerable to any weapon in the American arsenal. They hadn't counted on a man who learned geometry in a pool hall, who saw deflection possibilities that West Point had never taught, who understood that impossible shots sometimes require breaking every rule you've been given. Kellerman never called himself a hero, never claimed credit, never sought recognition. He had done what needed doing when doctrine failed, when conventional wisdom led to conventional death, when thinking in straight lines wasn't enough to save lives. Montgomery's daughter never learned to fish with her father, but other daughters did. Fairbanks' fiancée never got to honeymoon in Italy, but other couples did. Donovan's mother buried her only son, but other mothers didn't have to. That was sufficient. His grave is in Woodlawn Cemetery in Everett, Massachusetts. Standard military headstone. Name, rank, dates of service. Nothing about innovation, nothing about the lives saved, nothing about the 3-inch gap that changed everything. Just gray marble and grass and the occasional flag on Memorial Day, placed by grandchildren who know their grandfathers served but don't know. He revolutionized warfare with a pool shot that shouldn't have worked. The beam gaps are still there in modern fortifications. Engineers still leave them because steel and concrete must meet somewhere, and those joints create vulnerabilities that can't be eliminated without fundamental changes to how buildings are constructed. Military snipers still learn to find them, calculate the angles, bank rounds off interior surfaces to reach targets that direct fire can't touch. The technique that saved 381 lives in World War II has evolved, improved, and spread to conflicts around the world. But it started with a 12-year-old boy in Charlestown, Massachusetts, sinking impossible pool shots while an old man watched and understood that some people see the world differently. That sometimes the most important innovations come from the least likely sources. That geometry learned in a pool hall can prove more valuable than engineering learned at West Point. Winthrop Kellerman never called himself a hero, never claimed credit, never sought recognition. He'd done what needed doing when standard doctrine was failing. Montgomery's daughter never learned to fish with her father, but other daughters did. That was sufficient. If this forgotten story of street-smart innovation defeating military doctrine moved you, please like this video and subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. These innovations deserve to be remembered, and you're helping keep them alive. Frank Murphy had been right about young Jimmy Kellerman. The kid thought in ricochets. In war, that gift proved more valuable than anyone could have imagined. The technique that began with cigarette package sketches and borrowed protractors eventually found its way into classified training manuals used by special operations forces around the world. Modern military academies teach courses on unconventional ballistics and structural exploitation in urban warfare that trace their theoretical foundations directly to that March afternoon when Kellerman fired through a 3-inch gap. Defense contractors now manufacture specialized ammunition designed for deflection shots. Computer programs calculate optimal angles for structural ricochets. What started as street-smart improvisation has become high-tech precision warfare, complete with laser rangefinders and ballistic computers that would have seemed like science fiction to the men fighting in Italian mountains. But the core principle remains unchanged. Sometimes the impossible shot requires abandoning everything you've been taught and thinking like you're playing pool for quarters in a Boston neighborhood bar. Military historians studying innovation patterns have identified what they call the Kellerman effect, the tendency for breakthrough tactical developments to emerge not from formal research institutions, but from individual soldiers adapting civilian skills to combat scenarios, the carpenter who learns to breach fortified doors, the electrician who improvises communication systems, the mechanic who modifies weapons beyond factory specifications. These innovations rarely receive official recognition during wartime. They spread through informal networks, soldier to soldier, unit to unit, carried by men who understand that survival matters more than regulations. Only years later, sometimes decades later, do military institutions acknowledge their value and incorporate them into doctrine. The pattern repeats across conflicts and generations. In Vietnam, tunnel rats developed techniques that weren't in any manual. In Iraq, explosive ordnance disposal specialists created methods that saved thousands of lives but violated every safety protocol. In Afghanistan, forward observers learned to call fire missions using mathematics they invented in the field. Each innovation follows the same trajectory. Individual necessity drives experimentation. Success breeds imitation. Informal networks spread knowledge faster than official channels. Eventually, institutions catch up and claim credit for discoveries they initially resisted. Kellerman understood this instinctively. When younger snipers asked about official recognition for his technique, he would shrug and point to the scoreboard. Positions neutralized, lives saved, missions accomplished, numbers that mattered more than medals or mentions in dispatches. "War's not about getting credit," he told one persistent reporter years after the conflict ended. "It's about getting people home. Everything else is just paperwork." The beam gap technique now appears in military training programs from Fort Benning to Quantico to the Special Operations Command. Instructors teach mathematics with scientific precision, demonstrate the angles using computer simulations, and test students using standardized scenarios. The chaos and desperation that drove its original development has been sanitized into academic theory. But somewhere in those sterile classrooms, a few students recognize something familiar. They've played pool, they understand angles, they see possibilities that textbooks don't cover. Those are the ones who will find the next innovation, solve the next impossible problem, save the next group of soldiers who need someone to think in ricochets when straight lines lead to death. The gift passes on, generation to generation, carried by people who understand that the most important rules are the ones you have to break. Kellerman never knew his name would be whispered in modern military circles, that his pool hall geometry would save countless lives on battlefields he never saw. He died believing his contribution was merely a footnote in a forgotten war, one good shot among millions fired in anger. But innovation has its own momentum, its own lasting legacy. Somewhere today, in training facilities around the world, Soldiers learned to see angles their instructors never imagined, to find solutions in spaces between doctrine and necessity. The kid from Charlestown, who thought in ricochets, changed warfare forever, one impa possible shot at a time.